Welcome back, scholars. We are continuing our study of Native American myth with the Arcona origin myth. Native Americans, as it turns out, were largely monotheistic. They believed in usually one God who created everything, and the spirits that preceded humanity on the earth. Origin myths are fairly common in all cultures. We have a curiosity about where we came from and what we're doing here and how all this other stuff got here. In fact, psychoanalyst Carl Jung stated, "Myth is preeminently a social phenomenon. It is told by the many and heard by the many." Okay? So, in other words, we as human beings, we share myth, we discuss myth, we pass it along among ourselves. It is a sort of root curiosity. So getting to the Arcona myth, the first human beings were creatures of the dust, interestingly enough. And that kind of tracks, really, when you think about it. You see the origin of trees and plants, and you think, okay, they grow up out of the ground. Why not the two sisters who started it all? And so they began in the darkness, much like in the book of Genesis. Such is the case with the Arcona myth. The first human beings were created out of the dust, and that kind of tracks, right? You know, observing the world, you would see that plants come out of the ground, trees, grass, everything else starts off beneath the earth. Why not human beings? The first human beings were created from the dust, and they were brought out of the ground, much like Eve was, much like Adam was, and created from the dust of the earth. But they weren't ordinary creatures of the surface. Interestingly enough, when they attempted to worship the sun, first they were blinded by him. But then the sun told them, no, it wasn't me who created you. It was Utsiti who created you and made you in his own image, right? Which is, very similar to the account of the Bible. He says, when God created man, he created him in his own image. And much like Adam and Eve in the Bible, they were given dominion over the world. They were given the duty of not only naming everything, but in this case, they were given the duty, the job of propagating plants and animals and letting, essentially tending the world as if it were a garden, much like the Garden of Eden. They were given baskets, and they were said, okay, here's what you need to do. You will take what's in the basket, you will plant, you'll create life, essentially. Now, sisters are, of course, the sisters given agency over plants and small creatures. Notice here that the sun god tells them it's not yet time for the larger animals yet. Okay, and there's a certain logic to this because they have to create enough game animals, enough prey animals, rodents and smaller creatures, rabbits and what have you, so that the larger animals will have something to eat and to survive. And there's a certain logic to it. Like I said, myths are a means by which we explain how we got here and how all this other stuff got here as well. Excuse me. So the creation myth is an explanation of how we came to be and why we're here. The origin of evil here. Let's take a look at that for a second. So there comes a time when they realize the existence of evil. We all kind of run into it eventually. Either through betrayal or a death or a lie. Sometimes we come to the shocking realization that not everyone has our best interest at heart. And evil, in a very real sense, comes into the world for us, just as it did in the beginning. And in this case, it comes about as a sort of an accident because they're taking their baskets and they're creating things, and one of them accidentally spills an image, and it becomes this snake, which is an evil spirit. And the story tells us that this will be the one that comes and tempts Natsiti. We are told that this is the snake's entire purpose. And they're quite surprised by it. Did I create that? I don't think so. Well, but they leave it to go on its way. The story seems to imply that the arrival of the snake that causes the conflict between Natsiti and her sister. Right? It doesn't say outright that he tempted her, but not long after the snake's arrival, the trouble begins. Okay. To cause Nausicaa to trick her sister, Itsaku, by sending the magpie to shade the sun from her. They're in a contest, and one says, well, I'm older, so I should get to create things. And he says, well, I'll tell you what, we'll see who the sun shines on first. But there's the first kind of betrayal here, right? Wherein Nausicaa sends the magpie to go and shade the sun from his sister when it rises with his wings. So there are shades here too of the original Garden of Eden story, the betrayal of Abel by Cain, without the murder. But in this respect, when there is a break here, with evil comes into the world. Right? Further, they go on from here to defy the sun god by creating more people when he has told them not to. And so the sun god's reaction is, all right, fine, I'm going to withdraw from you. You do whatever you want to do. This is reminiscent, of course, from the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the betrayal and the break with deity here, the severing of the relationship between man and God. Okay, so in the final analysis, we see the two sisters parting much like the fall of Eden. This perhaps explains the diaspora, because Nausicaa has two sons, one that she likes and one she despises, and Iataku takes the son that Nausicaa doesn't like and goes far away and begins again there. Right? And so we have the explanation of the diaspora, how people came to the world, how this, at least the continent anyway, became so populated. Yes, because of this break between the sisters, and they parted company. This is why we have these people over here and these tribes over here. This is why the people who live far away resemble us, but are different from us. Right? They were our ancestors. They are our relatives, our way far-flung cousins who followed the sister who went to the other coast. All right. So, thus the mythos explains the world and how people came to be. Now, another quote here from Carl Jung. He said, "Myth is not fiction. It consists of facts that are continually repeated and can be observed over and over again. It is something that happens to man, and men do have mythical fates, just as Greek heroes do." And in many respects, that is the case here. We have the observable phenomenon of birth, of death, of growth. We have the phenomenon of betrayal. We have, a spiritual side that is often complicated and troublesome. That we have these relationships that are difficult. Another quote from Jung here. He says, "Myth is the revelation of the divine life in man. It is not we who invent myth, rather it speaks to us as a word of God." All right. So, just a few insights here into the Arcona creation myth. So what do you think? How does this story tell us about human beings? If you think about it, Joseph Campbell discussed mythology, and he talked about what he referred to as the monomyth. How all mythology is from the Greek myths, from the creation myths of Genesis, all the way up to the Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, is the same story basically. They're the same elements there. There is the call to adventure, the heroes and the villains, the archetypes, essentially good versus evil. It's the same old story over and over again that we are telling ourselves as a description of our human development and a part of our own sort of internal understanding of the world at large. Through myth, we make sense of the world that we otherwise wouldn't understand. Okay, so that is the Arcona creation myth. I hope you enjoyed it. Ponder these things. How does this sort of storytelling how is it similar to our own understanding of creation myths, either from Christian or from even, say, the Big Bang, which could be said to be a myth in and of itself. So it's unprovable, but it's a sort of set of archetypes, right? Now remember, myth does not necessarily mean untrue. I think Jung would agree in that. He would say that. He says, and again, what myth does is tells us about us. Again, quoting Jung, only a mythical being has a range greater than man's. How then can man form any definite opinions of himself? All right, so that was the Arcona myths, and I'll see you in the next video.